What I'd like to cover in this few minutes of modules, it'll be on various landing approaches and wind conditions, and an emphasis on making some fairly consistent landings, which in this airplane is a challenge for most of us. It's certainly for me, it's been one of the more difficult airplanes to land consistently with some smooth landings, even after you've had a fair amount of flying time with it. But there are some techniques that over the years, learning from others and learning my own, that I think have been pretty successful. And I'm going to cover two of them. Keep in mind, this is techniques. You probably find a lot of other people out there that can give you some guidance on it. But I do want to mention this, especially for new hires. When you're in simulator training, you don't get a chance to really make normal landings. Very often they're from instrument conditions, and that's pretty difficult. That's a lot more difficult situation than having good visibility of the runway like we have here. And we'll talk about that particular unique situation. But the thing is, many times in the simulator, we use an excuse that some of these landings that we have in the simulator, it's a simulator. It's not like an airplane. Well, there's maybe some half-truths or maybe some quarter-truths about that. But, I found over time, that's not really the case. You can make good landings in the simulator. The simulators, I think, are very good in this day and age for duplicating real conditions. So with that, when you're in training, one of the things that I'm going to suggest is that you ask your instructors to give you some time on making some multiple approaches. Get out on a short final just like this is right here, out here at 500-600 feet, released, and make some landings. You can get quite a few accomplished in a 20-minute period of time. And you'll be able to practice the two techniques that I'm going to talk about here if you want to try it. The other thing that is important to get some practice on is crosswind landings. And you don't get that in training. You have to get a few of them, and essentially you're looking for them to just get it on the runway. But there isn't much instruction on making crosswind landings in this airplane that you get in training. And, we're seeing some situations at companies where new pilots are having to come back for some additional training just specifically for landings. I think one of the ways we can preclude that is not to assume that everybody knows how to land an airplane in a crosswind or knows how to land this particular airplane in an effective way. So I want to try and cover some of that, and hopefully it'll be helpful. One thing before we get started that I do want to point out here, with this airplane and other airplanes too, I think this is why I've said in the past the nav display is one of the most critical instruments in the airplane. And as you're making an approach, you should be looking here at the wind vector during the approach to get some idea of what you're actually contending with, rather than maybe what was a tower call on winds, which are down there at the surface. But in this case here, another piece of information you have that gives you some information about what the wind condition is on the airplane is on the progress page 2, where you can see it gives you the crosswind component and the headwind component. And as we can see here with the winds that we have depicted on the nav display, there's just a slight crosswind from the left. These winds for any pilot would be certainly considered kind of benign, and you appreciate having winds like this for a landing. So I'm going to release us here. I'm going to keep the autopilot on, and I'm going to stop it at a couple points here to emphasize in this first technique. This is the first technique that I'm going to teach you, is that once you get down in an area around 30 feet, when you hear the 30-foot call and then you get 20 and 10, don't look close to you on the runway in this area here. When we get down closer, I'll show you. Look down the runway. Look down the runway about 3/4 of the runway down and start your flare looking at that point out there rather than real close to the airplane here in the landing zone. So what you want to do is shift that vision out in the distance. Now, I don't know the physiological reason for why that happens, but you know, it's a technique a lot of pilots use, and it's really pretty successful. I think I found that it's been a lot more consistent for me. So what we're going to do here is release this, and we're going to continue this approach. Again, like I said, I'm going to keep the autopilot on because what I want to do is point out a couple things here when we get closer. All right, here we go. Now, notice too that on the nav display, another piece of information we can see that we've got a crab. I mean, we do have a crosswind, a slight crosswind here. And we're on glide slope here, and this should pretty much take us into the touchdown zone area. And we're coming up on 150 feet. You're going to have some of these calls here. You'll have a call at 100 feet. You'll have a call at 50 feet. Right about here, a little bit lower. Instead of looking in this area right here to estimate and start your flare, look down the runway, down into this area down in here. Well down the runway. And use that as a viewpoint. You've shifted your viewpoint from here in close out a little bit further and start your flare. And for some reason, it's just a lot more consistency than when you get down into a 10-foot area and you're looking close in here as you rotate and you flare, which is a characteristic of most of us and what we learn. You rotate the main landing gear into the runway, you get some pretty hard landings. But if you have your focus out here, you pretty much can preclude that from happening. So anyway, that's a technique number one. Now, the second technique that I want to describe, I can describe from here as well. When you get down into this area, you're obviously manually flying at this point. When you get down into this area and you hear the 30-foot call, think. Notice I'm saying, that's my foot. Think. Just relaxing a little bit of the back pressure that you may have on the yoke. And instead of thinking about a flare, when you get down to, you hear the 10-foot call, then just think that yoke forward just a little bit. And again, not a positive force push, but just relax it a little bit and just maybe move it a fraction in your mind forward on the yoke. And what you're doing in that case is you're raising the main landing gear just a little bit as you're continuing down the touchdown point. And what it does is lessen the impact. It can be a very consistent way to land this airplane. That has been a real successful way for a lot of Boeing pilots over the years. That's something that goes way back to the days, gosh, I was flying a 727, where that was an acceptable technique. It's worked with all Boeing aircraft. So understand what I'm saying there is that when you get down into this area and you have a 30-foot call, just think about relaxing that back pressure a little bit that you may have on the yoke. A lot of it depends on how you trim, but most of us will maybe have a little back pressure we're holding on the yoke. And just start to think about relaxing it. And when you hear 10 foot, just let it go a little bit or just slightly move it forward. Again, this is a technique. You can practice these things in the simulator during training. And I would suggest that you ask your instructor, you want to practice some landings, come up with a technique. Now, a neat thing about this 10-foot relaxing point here is that whether the weather conditions are bad and I can't see down the runway or whatever the landing conditions are weather-wise, if I don't have the ability to look down the runway in the first technique that I had mentioned, this one works. And I guess I would say overall in my years of flying, that's the one that I really used most and found it to be successful. Now, the other thing I want to cover here too, and we'll cover it again in some of the other modules. If you have a dry runway, good visibility, you're looking to really put the airplane down as smoothly as you can for the little old lady from Pasadena. But recognize different weather conditions require different touchdown techniques. And one of them that I'm going to cover here right now is if the runway is wet, really wet. Now, most runways have grooves. It's a big help to keep from hydroplaning. But in these areas where you have a lot of rubber, those grooves aren't necessarily available to you. And some of the bigger airports, they have tire tread marks all the way down into the 3,000-foot area. So what you want to do is be very careful that your primary goal when the runway is slick and wet is to make a good, firm touchdown. Because what you want to do is break through the water. And even at that, with the speed you have, it's very, very likely that you could have some hydroplaning conditions that you create if you're trying to make smooth landings. So landing technique is different for different weather conditions. So we can go into some discussions on that at a later time. Talk about it with some of your more experienced pilots for those of you that are new. But make sure that when the runway is slick and it's raining, you make sure you do your best to preclude hydroplaning from having an opportunity to work on the airplane. And that's most important when you have crosswind conditions. All right, gang, this will end this session here. What I'm going to do is talk about crosswinds in the next session here. And that has some uniqueness too for this airplane. It's an area that you don't get much practice in training. And what little you do, it's just to see if you can get the airplane on a runway. And I'll tell you, for most of us, and I include myself, I was never a very good crosswind landing pilot, especially initially. But eventually you can. Some people are natural at landing an airplane in a crosswind. That's a very small percentage. Others have to really work at it. That's where most of us are. And we're going to talk about some of those techniques. The Boeing is a unique airplane. That's why even with auto lands here, you can land with a crab in this airplane. It can handle a certain amount of crab when you land in this airplane. But we'll talk about some of these things in the next couple of modules on landing. Hope this is maybe some information that'll be helpful to you. And we wish you well with helping yourself and making that trip nice all the way to the end for those people that are behind the door.